Britt.
Baseball is my oldest friend. Let me explain. When I was a boy, my family moved a lot. We moved a lot. I went to 5 grade schools, 2 junior highs, and 2 high schools in 5 different states. Now, for those of you keeping score, that's 9 schools in 12 years in 5 states, and that doesn't include the 2 states I lived in before I went to school. So, my 2 sisters and I were raised to be independent. Now, our parents taught us the basics: be honest, work for what you want, take responsibility, and be home for supper. And that's about it. So I thought that I learned more about life on a baseball diamond than I ever learned from my parents. My relationship with baseball started the summer between 2nd and 3rd grade when I moved from Jeffersonville, Indiana to Dayton, Ohio. And my father won my first baseball glove in a sales contest. Now, I don't want to sound ungrateful, but that glove was a sorry thing. It had these really stubby fingers and so much padding that there's no way you can make a pocket in it. But that's what I had, so that's what I learned. And I would spend hours throwing a ball up against the concrete stoop behind our row house. And I would throw grounders and line drives and pop-ups and even fly balls over my head. Now, being the only boy and the middle child, I was probably more independent than my sisters, certainly more curious. So I would borrow my older sister's bike, and I would go explore the area around our neighborhood. Well, one day I came across some boys playing in an empty lot. Now, I didn't know much about the game at that point, but I could throw and catch, so they invited me to play. First rule of baseball: find a field and you'll find some friends. Now, within the next year, I had my first experience with organized ball. Now, Bob Dylan once said that if you think you're better than no one and no one's better than you, then you really have nothing to win and nothing to lose. Well, long before I ever heard of Bob Dylan, I learned that lesson at my first baseball tryout. A bunch of grown men hitting grounders and fly balls to young boys and testing to see if they could put a bat on an object that was moving past them. And from the get-go, it was easy to see that some could do those things much better than others. And then you'd wait all week for one of those men to call you up and tell you he wanted you to be on his team. There were no trophies for participation in those days. You either made it or you didn't. That's a good preparation for life, I think. Fortunately, I made it. Now, I didn't play particularly much that year, but that's understandable because this league had the talent of the likes of my classmate Steve Yeager. Now, Steve Yeager played 14 or 15 years as the starting catcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers, including a World Series Most Valuable Player. In the 4th grade, Steve Yeager was much more physically mature than the rest of us. I swear the kid was shaving at 10. And so there he was, squatting behind home plate, controlling the whole game, and I'm realizing that I got a whole lot to learn. But then I moved. This time I moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. Now, I consider Salt Lake the golden age of my youth. First of all, I lived there 4 years, which is the longest stint I ever lived anywhere. Secondly, there was baseball in every direction. In the neighborhood, at school, Little League, even a Cleveland Indians AAA farm team called the Bees that my dad would take me to see. But best of all, I met my first best friend. His name was Mike Chambers. He was a wiry little guy, and truth be told, a much better all-around athlete than me. I don't remember how we met, but once we did, we were virtually inseparable. Now, I lived in the southeast corner of this subdivision, and I was surrounded by farmland, so there was plenty of room for young boys to roam. There were a lot of kids in this subdivision of all ages. Our little gaggle had about, 12 guys. Oh, and one girl who could throw harder and hit farther than the rest of us. One of the guys, his father was a farmer, and he owned this open field that butted up against the east side of the subdivision. And every spring, he would go out and mow a baseball field in the high grass, such that if you hit a fly ball into the uncut grass, it was a home run. In the summertime, we played there all day, every day. We'd come early and play till lunch, go home, maybe do a couple of chores, be back in the afternoon and play until it's time to go home for dinner. Now, we would only have, anywhere from 8 to 12 guys at a time, so we had to come up with a game that didn't need 9 guys on a side. So right off the bat, we're negotiating and compromising and trying to come up with rules that we could all agree on. And once the game started, well, you had to have some diplomacy, because if you pissed somebody off and they went home, then the game was off. I mean, you can play with 8 guys, but not 7. You see what I mean? And Mike and I, we even had to agree not to play on the same team all the time, because when we did, well, we usually won. When I was 11, I'm playing left field in Little League, and I'm still using that stubby little glove. And I remember one day the cool guy in class, you know that guy that knows more about life than you do. And he got a hold of one, and he drove it way over my head. And I turned, and I ran for the fence, and I reached up, and I grabbed that ball. And you could see every bit of white on it as it sat atop those stubby fingers. But I held on. And the next day in school, the cool guys, they kind of treated me a little different. They even chose me earlier when they're picking one side or another. So once again, baseball introduced me to some new friends. The next year I played first base, so I begged my mother to buy me a new glove. So she came home with this $6 piece of leather that was the exact opposite of my chubby little friend, in that it had no padding whatsoever. So after every practice and every game, I'd come home with the bruise right there. But somehow I managed to lead the league in fielding at a .997 average. Of course, I only hit 167, but that's another story altogether. So one day, this guy smashes a line drive to my right. Bang! Pop! And when I came in, there's a New York Yankee scout standing at the dugout, and he gives me an attaboy and a pat on the back and a bunch of pamphlets about the New York Yankees. Needless to say, I was ecstatic. And it took me a couple of years to realize that one play does not a career make, since I never met another scout the rest of my life. So the next year, I'm starting Babe Ruth League, and I finally get to play the position that I truly coveted, which is second base. And it didn't hurt my enthusiasm that this young rookie I was reading about in the sporting news also played second base. His name was Peter Edward Rose. And they nicknamed him Charlie Hustle, which I also thought was cool, because I always thought hustle was my game too. That man taught me more about effort and will and getting the most out of what you have more than anyone I can think of. Another lesson I learned that summer is how to save for the really important things in life. So I saved all my money that I made doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, and I went out and I bought myself a brand new glove. a $32 glove on sale for $16. And I took that home and I lathered it up with saddle soap and I tied it up with the ball in it so it would make the perfect pocket. And I played with that glove for the next 20 years. Another lesson I learned the next spring, still playing second base, and I didn't think I was playing all that well. I didn't seem to want to charge the ball, and I couldn't correct that. Well, one day in batting practice, I went in and filled in at third base, and I caught everything hit at me. Well, I say caught, but Now, I know that I have a tendency to think too much. And at third base, you don't have time to think, just react. So I learned a lesson, that we're all made to do something. Now, I wanted to play second base, but I was much better suited to play third. So the next day, I went out and bought myself an athletic cup, and I played that position for the rest of my days. One more lesson I learned in Salt Lake, when my dad would take me to the Bees games, I would see players that eventually made it to the major leagues. And one summer, I saw the great pitcher Don Newcomb on his way down, and a young pitcher named Louis Tiant on his way up. And I learned in that moment that everything in life has a beginning and an end. That's the human condition. And then I moved. This was the hardest move of all because I left behind a best friend that I never saw again. I went to Bath, Ohio, a little town outside of Akron. I was too late to play summer ball that year, but the next year I signed up and joined a team that was actually managed by the high school baseball and basketball coach. I even got to pitch a couple of games. Yeah. I had pitched two two-hit shutouts. I had good control. I didn't walk many. And I had a curveball that would break 3 feet. Now, you won't find many 15-year-olds that'll stand in a batting box when a ball's coming right at them before it drops and falls over the plate. Now, as good as my arm was from third to first, I did not have a blazing fastball. And that is still the standard by which pitchers are rated as good, bad, or indifferent. So the next spring, when I went out for the high school team, I never got a chance to pitch. So at this tender age of 16, I realized that life ain't perfect. But then again, our third baseman was one of the starting pitchers, so every time he pitched, I got to play. And because of that, I got enough innings in to earn my high school letter as a sophomore. You know, I'm as proud of that award as anything I've ever done. Who knows? Maybe next year I'll get to pitch. But then I moved. This time to the outskirts of Chicago. Now, I went from a class size of 250 to a class of 1,100, and I couldn't hit my way onto that team. Besides, this was the first place I ever lived that I didn't really fit in very well. Well, it was the 60s, and so my old friend and I, we kind of went different ways for a while, and I didn't play for a few years as I was pursuing this social experiment that was going on. But that only lasted a couple of years before I realized that what started as a movement of open-minded people moving toward a new way of being, a new social order, had become a movement of self-minded people who were running away from all their woes. And everything changed then. The language, the purpose, even the drugs changed. And I drifted off in another direction. But just like an old friend, baseball and I, we picked up the conversation right where we left off. And why not? It was the era of the big red machine. And I was there to watch it being put together. First this trade and then that trade. And I knew I was watching the best team I had ever seen, and most likely the best team I will ever see. So my excitement for baseball came back, and I started playing organized softball on a regular basis. And I went out eventually and bought a new glove that was better suited to softball, and I've used that for the next 15 years, and to my late 40s, when one day I dove for a foul ball and popped a nerve in my neck. I rehabbed out of it, but I was working for myself those days, and I knew I couldn't afford to be laid up. So my playing days began to dwindle. The last time I actually played wasn't that long ago. I went down to Rumpke Fields in Ross, Ohio to see my boys play. And as fortune would have it, that night they were a player short. So they asked me to play. Well, what guy doesn't want to play ball with his sons? And it had been a long time, but I knew I could still play. Now, they put me at first base, which is what you do with tall guys. And I even made a couple of those, patented first base scoops. I knew the footwork. Then I went chasing after this short foul ball. And in my world, if it's in the air, it's an out. But I tripped over my own feet, and I fell flat on my face. I can imagine what that looked like. And then I struck out twice. So this was the big lesson, the one I really didn't want to hear. I'd already learned it now, hadn't I? So I knew that it was my time, but I wish it didn't have to end so pathetically in front of my boys. So after that, my relationship with baseball changed again, but then why not? The game of baseball has changed. You don't see kids playing on empty lots anymore. And instead of me trying to find a game to find some new friends, I'm more likely to go out with old friends and try to catch a glimpse of their boyhood, of their enthusiasm for this game. I even have a girlfriend that actually likes baseball. And even better, she likes to hear me talk about baseball. That makes it pretty much a win-win right there. She's from Louisville, so every year we try to catch a Louisville Bats game or two where we see old veterans on their way down and young phenoms on their way up. That's life, I guess. Just a few weeks ago, I was headed her way when I got a call from my friend Paul. Hey, buddy, somebody just handed me tickets to the Reds game. She's not here tonight, so I can admit in that moment I hesitated. If I hadn't already been across the bridge, well, you know what they say. In baseball, there's always another day, and probably plenty more lessons to be learned. Thank you.
One more time for Dan Britt.